Hi friends, my name is Jenny and I'm back today to do another video. Today is going to be the start of a new vlog series here on my channel, which is going to be a series where I review some arcs that are kind of vaguely related to one another in a vlog each month. And so this month's theme is going to be nonfiction books, as I have two nonfiction books coming out in April that I thought would be fun to kind of pair together and talk about in tandem. So the two books that I'll be talking about, which I did also mention in my April TBR, so I'll put a link to that up in the cards above, are Low Country, a Southern Memoir by J. Nicole Jones, and Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back by Kate Aronoff. So both of these books, as I said, are coming out in April. J. Nicole Jones's memoir is coming out on the 13th and Overheated is coming out on the 20th. By the time this video comes out, Low Country should already be available and Overheated will be coming out the coming Tuesday after this video goes up. Since I already kind of explained what those two books are about in my April TBR, I'm not going to go into a ton of depth about them here, but I'll definitely put links to them down in the description box below, and obviously we'll be talking about them throughout this video in case you kind of want to learn more about them. But I have already started Low Country, so I thought I would just kind of give some preliminary thoughts on it now. I'm about a quarter of the way through it and I am enjoying this one. It's really beautifully written. I think J. Nicole Jones is really talented. However, at this moment, a quarter of the way through the memoir, I'm not entirely sure if this memoir has a purpose. It feels a little aimless right now. Like there doesn't seem to be a specific story that J. Nicole Jones was really trying to tell with this memoir, and I do feel like that's potentially a me problem because I usually don't love memoirs. I feel like even if it was the same exact story but it was a fiction novel, I always will automatically enjoy it more than it's a memoir. Like it has to be a really fascinating memoir with a lot of reflection that I find to be really engaging for me to usually like them. However, I picked this one because I heard that the writing was really good and also that the kind of placemaking elements of it were intriguing, and I definitely think both of those things are true, but the typical things that I don't like about memoirs are also here. J. Nicole Jones's family is from the Myrtle Beach area of South Carolina, where my family vacationed one time, and it's really like the Atlantic City of the southern coastal region. But it is interesting hearing her perspective on it as someone who grew up there and has family history there and also helped to contribute to kind of the ways in which it presents itself now. I do find that aspect of the memoir very interesting. So I'm intrigued about this one, and I do obviously will continue reading it. I am enjoying it so far. I'll probably at this point rate it like a 3.5 stars, but I'm hoping that it does gain a little more direction as I get further along into it. Hi, also, it's been a few days since I last updated you. I have now finished Low Country, a Southern Memoir by J. Nicole Jones, and I was planning on updating you at some point during the reading process aside from that first like impressions check-in, but I didn't really have a lot of kind of changing thoughts on it for the rest of the other like 75%. So here I am at the very end with my final thoughts. So in the end, I ended up giving this one 3 stars. I think I agree now at the end with my preliminary thoughts that I just mentioned of it not really having a strong purpose. I do think she kind of develops a lot of themes about familiar relationships and trauma throughout the kind of second half that are a little more kind of cohesive than the first half was. However, I do think this memoir didn't fully know where it was going, and so therefore there were a lot of threads, all of which didn't really come together in a very cohesive way. I also feel like J. Nicole Jones did not really know whose story she wanted to tell in writing this memoir, because it definitely wasn't her own story. She was a very peripheral character, I felt, to a lot of the discussion in this memoir, and I kind of wanted to know more about her story, and she alluded to it a bit towards the end, but definitely did not like develop herself as a character. Obviously she's a real person and this is a nonfiction work, but character is the word that comes to mind. But she kind of let herself be a side character in a lot of other people's stories throughout the memoir, which is fine, but I also wanted to know more about her and like what drove her to build the relationships that she did, and also why she chose to kind of write the memoir in the first place. I also found that she just included a few too many of her family members. There would sometimes be a chapter that was exclusively on like one family member who we then wouldn't really hear that much from in future chapters. So I also kind of wondered why she would include those chapters when they were not a person that seemed particularly formative to her. life experience. I don't know, it just brought up a lot of questions for me in terms of the memoir genre as a story about yourself when she was not really a part of this story. I will say I also enjoyed the kind of descriptions of the land, particularly of hurricanes. She has a lot of interest in hurricanes given that she's from this coastal region of South Carolina, and I think she writes about them in a really interesting way. She also pulls kind of from a lot of the folklore and mythology of the region, and kind of South Carolina in general and the Charleston area is really known for kind of ghost stories and things of the kind of more speculative nature, and I really appreciated the ways that she kind of incorporated that into the memoir and into her kind of telling of these stories. I thought that was really well done, and that was probably one of my favorite parts. I'm intrigued to see what she could do in terms of a fiction piece of writing. Like, I feel like she has a lot of interesting ideas, and I'd love to see them kind of explored more in a novel or in a short story than they were in this memoir. Like, I feel like some of those more speculative elements or the more kind of tangential elements of this memoir I think would be better suited to a different form than a memoir. So yeah, all in all, I did end up only giving this one 3 stars. I think part of that is like me and my dislike of memoirs and kind of questioning of the purpose of a memoir is something that I dig into more than perhaps other readers of memoirs do. So I do think a person who enjoys memoirs, particularly as they relate to the larger kind of placemaking of a place and larger familial ties, may find this one a lot more interesting. I know it's blurbed as akin to Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil and The Glass Castle, and while I've not read either of those books, I'm very familiar with both of them, and I feel like both make sense in that there's the very strong family ties of this memoir, and then also the kind of mythology surrounding the coastal South, I think, is something that Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil and Low Country touch on and kind of explore really well. So I did enjoy parts of this, and I would recommend it for the writing style and such. I felt the genre limitations of a memoir really kind of shined through a bit too much for me and my enjoyment of it as a story. So that is Low Country. Hi all, so I thought I would check in about my first impressions on Overheated by Kate Aronoff. I just read the first chapter and I read the introduction a few days ago when I last checked in, but then I was taking a break from it for a few days just because the introduction was kind of a lot. It wasn't the most cohesive in terms of what an introduction to a nonfiction book should be, in my opinion. It very much was kind of showing her viewpoint without actually explaining what like the book will entail, and her viewpoint in that introduction was a little murky, but I think it's become more clear having read the first chapter as well. So I believe what this book's primary argument is going to be that neoliberal politics slash the deregulation of markets by the federal government is going to cause the fossil fuel industry and other industries that are not interested in really intense climate regulation to control climate policy moving forward. And we're already seeing trends of Republican policymakers moving towards making climate policy, but perhaps not in ways that actually will kind of solve the problems of climate change, if that makes sense. So I think that's her primary argument, and this we're seeing as she kind of has a global approach. I thought this would primarily be focused on the United States, but she actually talked quite a bit about Germany and other European countries where this similar phenomenon is also happening, of Conservative Party members are interested in making climate policy, but in a different way than very progressive left policymakers are. And so I think her dichotomy is going to be of who gets to make climate policy and what does that look like, which I think will be really interesting. Aronoff is definitely a very big advocate of the Green New Deal and the kind of surrounding very progressive policy making that AOC proposed and Bernie Sanders proposed. And while I agree with the Green New Deal on a surface level, I think the Green New Deal is great aspirational policymaking, but is it realistic policymaking for the gridlock that America is currently experiencing and the kind of deep settled instability that is happening in America right now? Like, is something like the Green New Deal even feasible? I personally would say no, and so it's interesting to me that she is such an advocate for it. I'm curious about her position on some of Biden's climate policies, as I've been like reading a lot about them because he just proposed his Build Back Better plan or something. That's a $2 trillion plan that, while it doesn't explicitly address climate change, is about climate change. So I've been reading a lot about that in different like newsletters that I receive, and it's been interesting to kind of read their perspectives compared to this perspective. This book seems to kind of poo-poo that perspective, and yet that's the one that's actually happening. There's some traction there as opposed to the Green New Deal, where there's not actually any traction right now in terms of it being passed as a law. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with Kate Aronoff. I appreciate her critiques of and her concerns about a kind of more center policy like Biden's Build Back Better policy, but at the same time it's like perhaps a policy that is enacted now, even if it's not as radical as you would like it to be, is perhaps better than no policy until the radical one is at some point in the future proposed and put through Congress. So that's my thinking right now. Kind of on a related note, I was just reading yesterday a newsletter from The Atlantic, which is called The Weekly Planet, which if you're interested in climate change policy, I would highly recommend both The Weekly Planet and Grist has a few newsletters, and Grist is entirely about like kind of climate solutions and its relationship to policy. I will put a link to both of those things down in the description box below. But I was just reading in The Weekly Planet. This one was from a few weeks ago and I was just now getting to it. It was an interview with someone who works for an economic think tank in DC that is proposing federal regulation on financial institutions in relation to climate change, and it was talking a lot about how one of the big goals should be to kind of reinforce regulation of the market of large financial institutions and kind of encourage them to develop or incorporate risks, climate risks, in terms of their investments, and also make their constituents more aware of the risks that climate change poses to some of their investments. I thought that was really apt, and I'd be very curious to see if Aronoff kind of digs into or proposes that more stringent regulation is a path forward, or if she has other ideas. So that's kind of what I'm thinking so far. It definitely is a thought-provoking read. I mean, I think any book that you agree with some things but disagree about other things is always going to be thought-provoking, and this one definitely is thought-provoking in that way. So I'll probably read a bit more of it today, and we'll continue to check in as I like have thoughts about it. I think I'll probably have more thoughts about this one in general than I did about Low Country. Hi all, so it's been close to a week since I last updated you on Overheated, and that's in part because I kind of fell off the bandwagon of reading it. As you would have seen in my April reading vlog, which I'll put a link to up in the cards above in case you want to check it out, I was super busy in like the second half of my time off of work, and so I just didn't really have time to sit down and think about issues of climate change and its relationship to neoliberalism all that often. Now I am back to work today, so I did have some time last night and then today to read through the rest of part 1, so I thought I would kind of update you on my thoughts. First and foremost, I do want to say that I think the central thesis of this book is a really valuable one, and I think it's fairly well articulated. I do have some issues. I think Aronoff at times uses language that's a little too convoluted to fully get her point across, and I think she also has to sometimes make some concessions, particularly given the way that the Biden administration is approaching climate policy through his Build Back Better plan, which I'll get more into that relationship in a minute. I think she has to make a lot of concessions, which does sometimes weaken her argument, but I do think her kind of overall argument of the relationship that big oil companies have had to policymaking in the last 40 years or so has majorly impacted the way that the discussion around climate change has happened, and therefore also has strong potential to impact future climate policy. So I find that argument to be a really valid one, and I think she has really strong evidence to back up the ways in which, despite even kind of green coding their companies, such as like Shell and I think BP, or maybe, I don't think it was ExxonMobil, I think it was BP, has claimed that they will be carbon neutral by 2050. You know, we see these kind of claims of climate advocacy from oil companies, and yet they're not actually showing that in terms of the projects. And so I think that is a really interesting argument, and I think it's a very fair one to make. And actually it builds really nicely off of a book that I read like 2 years ago, I'm gonna say, which is Losing Earth by Nathaniel Rich, which talks about this kind of early investigations into climate change by oil companies in the 1970s, when they first kind of realized this was a problem, particularly around the passage of the Clean Air and Water Acts in 63 and 72 respectively. And so I think this book does a really great job of outlining that early history. Losing Earth ends in 1989 with James Hansen's testimony to the Congress, and Overheated kind of continues that dialogue to basically the present day. So I thought that was really helpful to kind of get that additional background on that. And obviously it's incredibly frustrating, just as it was frustrating to read it in Losing Earth, it's frustrating to read that in Overheated as well, because obviously oil companies are hugely influential to our economies and our livelihoods at this point in time, which is not great because they are directly causing climate change. So that part of the argument I think is really important. I also think that her kind of establishment and acknowledgement of the importance of the Green New Deal and its role that it has had and will have in shaping climate policy is, again, another very important one. I think the Green New Deal will kind of historically be cited as something that was really important to shaping climate policies, but I think where she falls short in that is that as someone who is part of the progressive left, I assume based on her Twitter and her kind of overall perspective on things that she would classify herself as a democratic socialist. I think she presents the Green New Deal as the solution that is going to happen, and that's where I think her argument kind of falls a bit short, because it's not. You know, Biden has his Build Back Better plan that seems to be kind of moving forward. That is not the Green New Deal in its initial form. Like, yes, and she even acknowledges this, and this is kind of one of the concessions she has to make, of it was most definitely influenced by the Green New Deal, but it's not the Green New Deal in totality. And I do think that is somewhere where she kind of struggles, and where the kind of Green New Deal's biggest advocates struggle as well, of this kind of all or nothing ideology, whereas I don't think that that is necessary, personally. I do think that a $2 trillion plan will do a lot to impact our current economy and also the ways in which climate change is managed and adapted to, than nothing. But I can obviously also see that 16 trillion, or whatever the original amount was, I believe my dad said that Bernie Sanders' plan was 16 trillion. Obviously that would do a lot more, but 2 trillion is also going to do a lot. So I think that is kind of my biggest gripe with it so far. The other issue I have with it, and this kind of also ties into kind of personal interests and where my like fascinations with climate change mitigation and adaptation lie, in that it's not particularly in like the job sector, the energy sector. That's just not really where I foresee myself working. Well, obviously, like, that's a huge part of climate mitigation, is transitioning people that currently work in the fossil fuel industry, particularly as low wage workers, and transitioning them to clean energy jobs and potentially other jobs. I think that is a very important aspect of the climate crisis solution. However, that's just not where my interests are, but that most definitely is where Arnoff's interests are. And I do struggle a bit with how she kind of frames that discussion, similarly to, I think, how the Green New Deal itself framed the discussion, and that it felt very much playing into the ideologies of like the coastal elite and their perceptions on what rural communities that are impacted by the oil industry are like, and what kind of people living in former places of coal mining are like, and just kind of the general personalities of those people get, I think, stereotyped, but also they become malleable to say like, and someone who works in an oil rig right now will be a teacher. And it's like, well, do they want to be a teacher? Is that a question that you have asked them? You know, like, community driven solutions are a hugely important aspect of creating these clean energy jobs, and yet, you know, saying like, oh, everyone will want to become a teacher. It's like, okay, a lot of people don't want to become teachers. So I think that aspect of her kind of, it almost comes across as a naivete, and I don't want to say that lightly, because, you know, obviously she's thought a lot about these issues, but I know it just, the way that she discusses this very idealized version of how a transition to like a clean energy economy will work is something that I personally struggle with when I hear kind of people that are on the progressive left talking about that transition, just because I feel like it comes from a place of being removed, oftentimes, not exclusively, being removed from people that are working in those fields. The other thing I quickly wanted to mention is that I do feel like there is some kind of interesting ways that the Democratic Party is being characterized here, particularly the history of the Democratic Party, in that Arnoff seems to be drawing a lot on the New Deal, which makes sense because the Green New Deal is obviously in part modeled after the New Deal of FDR's day. But she seems to sometimes kind of muddle the history between what happened to the Democratic Party in the 1940s and neoliberalism that kind of began to root itself in the Democratic Party in the 70s and 80s. And there was a huge shift in the Democratic Party in terms of like the Dixiecrats and Southern Democrats during the 1960s and the civil rights movement, and the shaping of the Democratic Party around those ideologies is something that I feel like she doesn't really touch on when discussing the changes of the Democratic Party from Roosevelt's day to the present day. And so that's frustrated me a little bit as well, because I feel like it's somewhat minimizing the complicated narrative and history of the Democratic Party as an entity that is kind of maneuvered by different forces. Because like the Southern Democrats during the 1950s and 60s were a huge part of the Democratic Party, but they were also rooted in white supremacy. So it's like, and that's the same party that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a part of. So I feel like there's different aspects of the Democratic Party and its history that she's kind of picking and pulling from that I feel like kind of also simplifies the narrative in a way that I don't super appreciate. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think the book is very well researched at times, but then at certain places I'll read something and just be confused as to what she either means here or what she's trying to convey, because from my understanding, things are actually different than the way that she's conveying them in the text. So those are kind of all my thoughts right now. I'm about to get into part 2, which is a lot more about, I think, the Green New Deal and its potential for creating a more equitable society, which I think will be interesting, and I'll be very curious to kind of dig more into what she is pulling from the Green New Deal and saying are the best kind of policy aspects of it. Hi all, it is Saturday morning, April 17th. And I have 3 more chapters to read plus the conclusion, so I guess technically 4 chapters of Overheated to read today, because I'm hoping to post this vlog tomorrow. So I think I don't really have any other plans for today except for reading, so I think I'm going to be reading a chapter of this and then a buddy read that I'm also working on this weekend, and kind of alternating between the two. I don't have a ton of kind of new updates to share that are different than what I've said previously. I will kind of wrap up the book with some of my kind of final thoughts, but yeah, so I don't want to say too much right now just because I don't know how much my perspectives will shift. I do feel like this book is kind of situating itself in a few too many contradictory places that make it difficult for me to, one, parse out her argument and what she kind of suggests as policy solutions, and 2, what she believes is actually realistic for accomplishing, as I feel like there's a lot of pessimism and negativity here about reality, and then a lot of hopefulness about something that she's kind of indicated through her pessimism about reality that is totally improbable. So I find that kind of dichotomy a little difficult to support and kind of wrap my head around. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. So I'm getting a little frustrated with this argument style and the way that it's kind of approaching these topics. But I'll kind of get more into that once I've finished the book and like have kind of proper concluding thoughts. Also, we can't have a vlog without the kitty, so here he is sleeping on the bed. It's not been long, but Overheated just mentioned Heather McGhee, who wrote The Sum of Us, which I read earlier this year and really liked, which reminded me that if readers who are interested in Overheated want another book to read, I would highly recommend The Sum of Us. Particularly, Heather McGhee has a section on the climate crisis in this book that is called The Same Sky, and that chapter I think does a great job of kind of summing up in a more concise and cohesive way the ways in which reinvestment in the social democracy infrastructure of America could help to solve the climate crisis, which in short is I think what Kate Aronoff's primary argument is, and Heather McGhee dives into that a lot more, particularly in a way that's rooted in social democracy as opposed to democratic socialism, which I think is important for the kind of current political climate and the political ideology that we primarily have here in the United States. So would highly recommend The Sum of Us if you are watching this vlog and are interested in Overheated and kind of interested in issues of social democracy and the relation to the climate crisis. I think Heather McGhee touches on that, albeit it's not the primary focus of this book, but she touches on that a lot in this book as well. I also wanted to check in before I film another video, which should be coming out this coming Thursday, with my final thoughts on Overheated by Kate Aronoff, which I finished last night. And I've talked a lot about a lot of what my thoughts are throughout the rest of this vlog, so I'm not going to go into depth about any of the kind of rehashing of any previous topics. However, I did just want to include a few other things that I had some gripes with. Unfortunately, I only gave this book 2.5 stars just because I did really have some issues with it and the way that it presented its argument, particularly in the second half. So I think my biggest gripe with this book and my biggest critique is that it is simply too long. Kate Arnoff does not have enough material or enough of a kind of complicated, nuanced argument to warrant the 350 plus pages of text that this book has. So I found, particularly in the second half, that she was restating her argument and restating her ideology and her ideas, sometimes directly from like previous chapters. Like she would use the exact same phrasing that she had in previous chapters when discussing ideas of the Green New Deal or discussing the role fossil fuels companies had. Like the repetition of those ideas was not really benefiting me as a reader. In fact, it was just making me more frustrated because she wasn't adding any complexity or nuance when she'd return to an idea that she'd already argued for previously. I also found, and I think I mentioned this previously, that the ways that she kind of approaches policymaking sometimes confused me a bit, and I think this is in part because she's a journalist, so she's not particularly directly related to climate policy making. In fact, she's kind of more on the exterior of that, critiquing potential climate policies. And so I found sometimes that the policies that she proposed just didn't seem at all realistic, or they seemed contradictory to one another, especially when she was talking about kind of global politics, as she really reinforces throughout the book the importance to her of climate reparations for the global south, particularly given that the history of the relationship between the global north and the global south is one that's full of a lot of resource extraction. And so there are reasons for providing reparations to the global south because of the lost resources that the global north extracted through colonialism and capitalism after colonialism. And so I totally understand that, but then at the same time, she'd go through certain kind of decarbonization for the US specifically and policy suggestions she had for that, which often were very insular, kind of national oriented economic policy regarding global trade. It just showed to me kind of a lack of understanding of like the complexities of global trade at times and the ways that that kind of interacts on a global sphere and how US policies do greatly impact the rest of the world. And so I was really frustrated by those elements as well. And then, as I mentioned kind of previously throughout the rest of this vlog, I was particularly frustrated by the way that she is so critical of President Biden's policy, and I do think that that's in part because of a poor timing in terms of the publication of this book being right after Biden has announced his Build Back Better plan, and obviously she didn't know about the details of the Build Back Better plan when writing this book, but it just felt kind of incongruent to me in terms of the discussion that I see other people interested in climate policy having about Biden's Build Back Better plan and the way that she frames President Biden and his climate policies in this book. And I do think that's in part because of the limitations of like writing a book about very current politics, is that by the time that the book comes out, those politics may have shifted slightly. Yeah, so overall, I wasn't a huge fan of this book. As I said, I gave it 2.5 stars. I do think there is an audience for this, particularly those who kind of are aligned with her political ideology of basically breaking down the democratic system of the United States and having democratic socialism instead, which I'm not quite there yet. I am a very progressive-minded person. I definitely agree with ideas of social democracy, but I'm not quite a democratic socialist, and so some of the ideology that she put here was just a little too out there for me. But I do think that those who kind of are more closely aligned with that political ideology may get more out of this book than I did. I just am a bit too kind of pragmatic in terms of my climate solutions and what I'm kind of interested in related to climate change to really get along with this book fully. So those are my thoughts on Overheated, and that's gonna wrap up this ARC vlog. I hope you have enjoyed me talking about these two books in depth. I definitely will be continuing to do this. Next month I will be reading 3 books coming out in late May/early June that are all feminist literary fiction books, so do look out for a vlog of those things within the next month. If you are new to the channel, I would love to have you stick around and subscribe. Thank you also to all my new followers from Olive's channel. I really appreciate you coming and subscribing to my channel. It means a lot to me. So if you're a new subscriber, please do let me know down in the comment section below. I'd love to say hi and welcome you to the channel. And I think that is everything. I hope you're having a great rest of your day whenever you watch this, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.